In this lesson, we'll discuss small lettering, which can be problematic in the embroidery industry unless you know a few basics, which we'll go over here. First thing we have is a typical logo, and you can see from the inch ruler that it's about 4 inches by 1.5 inches, which is a good left chest or even a hat center crest logo. And what typically happens, and what brings up the small lettering problem, is that often the customer will ask for descriptive text below the logo to fit within the same width. And usually that text is a lot longer. In this case, a common thing that might be put below this is embroidery machines, for Happy Brand embroidery machines, for example. So we'll go ahead and type that out, picking a particular font. And we'll start out small. This is defaulted to about just under a 1/2 inch tall, but as you can see, that's not quite fitting. So we're going to have to shrink that down a little bit. I'm going to adjust the space here a little bit, so we'll put something very small, 0.02, to give it some room between the letters. But now what we'll do is shrink that text so that we can fit, according to our imaginary customer request, that it fits within the width of the top logo. So as we shrink it, this is where the problem with small lettering comes in, is that the customer request usually makes the text too small in many cases, or it's easy to make the text too small to be readable. So we've shrunk that down, and we'll go ahead and generate the stitching. And let's take a look at this really quickly. First of all, your controlling limiting factor is the satin stem width here, and you can see if we view this close up, we can measure that very quickly. The first thing I do is set my grid size to the smallest width that a satin stem can be, which is 0.04 inches or 1 millimeter. You typically don't want any of your lettering stems to be shorter, to be narrower than that. And let's go ahead and view that here so that you can have that grid as a quick comparison. And you can see that, for example, just by eyeballing the width of this, the H in Happy, you can see it's about 4 millimeters wide, which is ideal. You typically want to make sure your satin stitch stems are between about 1.5 millimeters to about 6 or 7 millimeters wide. Anything shorter than 1.5 millimeters, you're running into trouble. Anything longer than about 6 or 7 or 8, you want to think about making it a fill stitch instead of a satin stitch. And you can see for the most part that the word happy is fine. All the satin stitches are above that limit and within about an ideal limit of 2 to 4 millimeters. Now let's look at the small text that we've made according to the quote-unquote customer request. You can see the stem width for the top crossbar and the E, and it fits around that 1 millimeter minimum. 1.5 millimeters is better, but ideally, 1 millimeter is okay. Even the wider stem here is fine. In fact, this crossbar is fine. But you can see on this particular Times serif type font that the small crossbars are well below that millimeter. So you have basically too much detail here, and that's below that millimeter minimum, and that tends to junk up a little bit, and then basically just doesn't sew a smooth satin stitch to explain. And also any interior spaces where you have less than 1 millimeter block wide, any full grid block wide, will tend to sew together. The space here will tend to collapse because you're everywhere that, if you can imagine, everywhere a stitch point is, you're making a hole about the size of a grid block. So if you imagine that, even when we're zoomed in here, that's a lot of holes, and that's collapsing that. So the interior loops of this B are okay, the R is okay, but all this is starting to close up. So we're really seeing an overall problem. So how do we address that? First thing you want to do is use a font that is made for smaller lettering. I chose Cheltenham Large here just as an example of what not to do, and we can edit that really quickly. We'll go into editing and select one of the letters, and if you click on the green A, which is called character edit, you can bring your text back out to a retypable, reshapeable form. And all we're going to do is choose a different font. In this case, this is Cheltenham Large, which is a lot like Times New Roman, but there's another version of Cheltenham that comes in your Stitch and Sew program called Cheltenham Small, and let's do that, for example. And Now let's go ahead and resize our text to fit that allowable area according to our customer spec. Okay, we'll even make it just a little bit smaller. Okay, and we'll hit stitch it, and you'll see that when we zoom back in, there's going to be some differences. For example, if you remember the previous version of this, the stems were running at 90 degrees here and making really short stitches. Also, you'll notice that the shape of this particular font, even for the same lettering height, you can see that the digitizer who made this font made the stems artificially wider, so you're closer to that ideal stitch length. So you can see that the areas are a little bit more open. This might close up a little bit, but generally it's the letters are a little bit more open. So this font, even though it's the same font, because it's an embroidery font, all of your stitch and sew fonts versus your true type fonts are made by a digitizer and made for particular situations. For example, there's multicolored text, monogram text. In this particular case, we want to highlight for small lettering the Cheltenham Small. There are other fonts that are made for that. A1 is a great block font, and A2 is also a great almost times or stem type font that can sew out even a little bit smaller than this. You can see this is about 4.5–5 millimeters, which is really the limit. But you can expect that to be readable even at the customer specification. One more thing before we go. Another thing that is not understood is also satin stitch settings. For the lettering here, you also want to use a minimal underlay, and you can see there's only a centerline underlay here, but let's edit this letter and let's give it an ideal. Let's take a look at those particular settings. So minimal underlay, and you can see that's a central underlay. Give a little bit of stretch, which bold faces the letter just a little bit, and also you want a lighter density at 4.0 or 4.5. Even though this may look open, remember that we're zoomed in really close, so the lines are actually thinner than the stitches themselves. So again, lighter density, simpler underlay, and a little bit of stretch is ideal. Versus if we look at this particular letter, if we go to the embroidery settings for it, for wider satin stitches, you want a heavier density. So this one's actually wrong. And plus a little bit more supporting stitches. So something like 3.0 and fill or zigzag type underlay, or even if you can get away with an edge walk underlay. And we'd apply, and you'll notice that's significantly heavier and you have more supporting stitches underneath. This kind of underlay will not, while it works on larger letters, if you can imagine this kind of underlay underneath the small letters, there's not enough room, and it will often muddy up the text with too many stitches that even stick out beyond the edges of the lettering. So in conclusion, make sure that whatever you size your text at in small lettering, that your stems don't go underneath that 1 millimeter minimum. Choose a font that's made for small lettering. That way its stems and shapes are more easily taken to these smaller sizes that your customers may request. And finally, use the simpler settings like a slightly light density of 4 to 4.5, centerline underlay only if any, and 10% stretch. And that should dramatically improve the quality of your small lettering and readability in typical embroidery jobs.